presentation. Before I do that, I'd like to invite APSL's President, Mohan Siriwardena, to say a few words. Mohan.
Thank you, Tariq. Let me share this. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are on. Welcome to our first event for 2025, Ask the Expert series event. As an organization, Association of Professional Sri Lankans, we are a like-minded group of professionals who've come together to serve Sri Lanka whilst being abroad and doing a number of events as well as projects to support the development of Sri Lanka. The Association of Professional Sri Lankans was formed in 2004, 28th of February. So effectively, we are 21 years old as of today. We are as far as our management is concerned, we are a group of volunteers, but professionals living and working in the UK, and we are a registered charity in the UK, which means we come under the regulatory arm of the Charity Commissioner of UK. Amongst our projects, we've got a number of projects that directly support the development as well as provide relief and aid to Sri Lanka. Our cancer relief project provides direct support to those affected by cancer, including providing support for medicine and other necessary aid. Our disaster and emergency relief project has provided on a number of occasions. We have intervened to provide direct and rapid relief to those affected by floods, by the pandemic, and so on. APSL's scholarship scheme provides scholarships to underprivileged children in Sri Lanka, and we've now got nearly 150 students who are being currently supported by monthly payments, as well as we support them in their English language education. Florence De Silva Memories Trust Fund, again aimed at supporting children. So through that project, we've delivered books to schools as well as renovated schools and so on, again mainly aimed at helping children in Sri Lanka. Our Solar Villages project helps in terms of promoting renewable energy, in particular solar power, and using solar energy not just to generate electricity but also to support rural development. We have a number of solar villages that we've established in Sri Lanka during the recent past. Living in the UK series is another project that Association of Professional Sri Lankans in the UK conducted. And through this series, we aim to educate particularly children living in the UK as to how to balance living in the UK whilst not forgetting the roots as well as Eastern values. This Ask the Expert series, we've been conducting this for more than 15 years now, and during this period we've had eminent speakers delivering a number of lectures on topics that are relevant to Sri Lankan professionals as well as to the country. And today we are extremely grateful for Dr. Indrajit Coomaraswamy, who's the former governor of Central Bank of Sri Lanka, to who's agreed to deliver this very important talk. We Sri Lanka project is originally formed at promoting reconciliation, rebuilding, and reconstruction of Sri Lanka, particularly during the aftermath of the completion of the civil conflict. Our next event, as part of this We Sri Lanka event talks, um, is in line with celebrating the International Women's Day. And this is an in-person event, and it will be held on Saturday, 15th of March in London, Imperial College. So the publicity is out there already, and we've got a number of eminent speakers, again, Sri Lankan professionals who made contributions not only to Sri Lanka but at an international level. And the core topic is around unlocking the women's ingenuity for advancement and well-being of humanity, celebrating the work they've done, and promoting discussion around in relation along with the theme of International Women's Day. So if you are able to attend the event, please do so, and please register to attend this event. So I hope that kind of provides an introduction to APSL, who we are and what we do. If you like what we do, please join us. We invite your comments and your suggestions, improvement in terms of how we can further improve our work and how we can further help to support Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohan. I'd like to now welcome our esteemed guest speaker, who's also a member of APSL's ExCo, Indrajit Coomaraswamy. He doesn't need an introduction, as many of you will know him from his impressive career in the private sector and also his contribution to Sri Lanka, most notably, as Mohan said, the previous governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. We're really lucky to have him with us. There will be a Q&A session after the presentation, and that will be facilitated by Rohan De Alvis, who's one of the past presidents for APSL. Indrajit, thank you very much for taking the time. Welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Tariq. Greetings to everybody online, wherever you are. It's a great pleasure to participate in an APSL event again. What I'm going to do is to very briefly talk about some significant improvements that have taken place in terms of the economic conditions, as well as the frameworks for policy making, but also to point out that there's absolutely no room for complacency, because there's a great deal more to be done. So we've seen a very impressive stabilization of the economy over the last 3 years. You will recall about 3 years ago at this time, the situation was extremely dire. Many of you may not have been in Sri Lanka at the time, but your TV screens would have been full of very disturbing scenes coming out of Sri Lanka at that time. Well, now, significant improvement. All the macroeconomic indicators have recorded much better than expected outcomes. And just last night, the IMF Executive Board completed successfully the third review of Sri Lanka's program and approved the disbursement of the fourth tranche. So by Monday, that money should be in the account of the government of Sri Lanka. In addition, the debt restructuring is pretty much completed. There are a few administrative details that need to be finalized, but the negotiations are over, and it has been a very complex exercise. The government has had to negotiate with 5 different groups of creditors. So they've done extremely well to get this done. It was one of the, as I said, one of the most complex debt restructuring negotiations that have taken place for a middle-income country. So these are all very positive developments. And another important advance that has been made is that there is now a new paradigm for macroeconomic policymaking in Sri Lanka. Those of you who are familiar with the Sri Lankan economy would remember that the economy has been beset by repeated bouts of macroeconomic stress. This has been reflected in the fact that Sri Lanka has had to go to the IMF 17 times. Now, I would like to present to you the steps that have been taken to try to break that cycle of these repeating bouts of macroeconomic stress. And there are clear frameworks that have been put in place which should help us to break this cycle that has beset the economy since really the liberalization of the economy in 77. I'm going to focus on that period because the earlier period had a different structure for the economy and different policy framework. So I'm going to focus from after 77. And since that time, the main cause of the repeating bouts of macroeconomic stress has been unsustainable government budget deficits. And these budget deficits have been caused by a toxic combination of populist politics and an entrenched entitlement culture amongst the population. These two phenomena have fed off each other, and there has been a kind of negative feedback loop which has dragged the country down. And this has happened time and again. And usually the crises can be matched with the electoral cycle. The discipline goes when an election approaches. You see, as each of the IMF programs is embarked upon, there is some discipline that is introduced and the economy stabilizes. But as elections come, again, we go back to square one. Lee Kuan Yew famously said that elections in Sri Lanka are auctions of non-existent resources. And that was a pretty, I think, apt commentary on the way things transpired, or have been transpiring for many years now. And this has happened under successive governments. So let me expand a little bit on how the causes of the government policies have fed into these repeated cycles of macro stress. So, as I said, time and again, there's unsustainable budget deficits which are recorded by governments. What that does is that it pumps a lot of excess aggregate demand into the system. And that excess aggregate demand fuels inflation on the one hand, and some of that excess aggregate demand leaks into imports and brings about pressure on the external balance of payments of the country. And when that happens, and with inflation highly elevated and the country running out of foreign exchange because of the leakages into imports, then we go to the IMF. And then we stabilize the economy, usually after an election. And then again, the cycle is repeated as the next election comes. Then the unsustainable excess aggregate demand that has been caused by the large budget deficits, the impact of that is amplified by what is called fiscal forbearance in monetary policy. By that I mean that the central bank adds to the problem through its conduct of monetary policy. So there are two channels through which the central bank has time and again added to the problem of excess aggregate demand. One is through financing the deficit of the government, and the most egregious way is to print money. And the mechanism used for that is that the central bank basically buys government paper, the treasury bills and bonds, and gives the government basically new money, printed money. So that clearly adds to the excess aggregate demand in the system. Another thing that the central bank does, in order to reduce the cost of borrowing for the government, it artificially suppresses the interest rate structure. Now, during the last political dispensation, a 5% cap was put on the benchmark 1-year Treasury bill rate. So that, of course, brings down the whole yield structure of both government instruments as well as private interest rates. So that, again, feeds into more demand than is desirable, and the excess aggregate demand problem is amplified, and the inflation is further elevated, and the balance payment comes under even more pressure. So this playbook was repeated time and again, and as I said, for much of the 17 IMF programs, this was a problem that was being confronted through the program. But then, as I said, as elections come, we slip back again. Now, what is different this time around? And I should also say, when there is this pressure on the balance of payments, the exchange rate comes under pressure. And then there's a double whammy that is kind of introduced into the system, because what the government does is that it tries to hold the exchange rate by depleting its reserves. It gives its reserves into the market to meet the excess demand for foreign exchange. And that depletes the country's external reserves. And eventually, as the reserves run out, you have to go to the IMF. Now, this cycle or this playbook has been repeated time and again, as I said. So what has been done now, which will hopefully break this cycle of repeated bouts of macroeconomic stress? One is the fiscal rules have been tightened. What do I mean by that? Now, even earlier in 2002, there was what was known as the Fiscal Management Responsibility Act, where there was actually a fiscal rule that the government's debt should not exceed 70% of GDP. But that target was to be met 10 years down the line. Now, each time that deadline approached, Parliament pushed the deadline back. And so that fiscal rule was utterly ineffective. But now, what has happened is there's a new Public Finance Management Act that was passed last year. And what it does is it sets very clear targets each year. So the government has to have a primary surplus in its budget. What does that mean? It means that total revenue minus expenditure, excluding interest payments, must be in surplus by 2.3% of the GDP. So what you're doing is you're making sure that you're paying for that year's expenses, and having an extra surplus of 2.3% to start paying down the excessive debt that we have. So that target has to be reached every year. In addition, in order to reach that target, there is an expenditure cap, what they call primary expenditure, that is total expenditure minus interest payments, of 13% of gross domestic product, and a revenue target of 15% of gross domestic product. So you have these three very clear fiscal rules which provide a framework for budgetary policy in the future, so that we live within our means. We have had great difficulty in achieving that. Hopefully this is now embedded in law, right? So as long as the government adheres to the law, we shouldn't have these problems. The root cause of the problem, these excessive budget deficit, hopefully will be a thing of the past. And I did say that the central bank's monetary policy also amplified the problem. And I mentioned deficit financing and financial repression. Now, the central bank can no longer lend to the government in any way. It can't buy the treasury bills and bonds and print money that way for the government. It cannot give temporary overdrafts to the government. So the government cannot rely on the central bank for any inflationary financing in future. So that's the rule that's been introduced through the new Central Bank Act. And as far as its financial repression was concerned, that is artificially manipulating interest rates, you can't do that either, because a flexible inflation targeting regime has been introduced as the regime for monetary policy formulation in the country. What does that mean? That means basically that the finance minister sets an inflation target in consultation with the governor, and then the central bank has what they call instrument autonomy. It can use all the tools it has at its disposal to make sure that the inflation target is met. Currently, the inflation target is 5% plus or minus 2% on either side. So you can't artificially now set a cap for the interest rates, etc. This is now we have a data dependent, forward looking routine for monetary policy formulation, which should prevent this artificial suppression of interest rates, which then leads to unsustainable credit expansion. So these two pieces of legislation they are game changers, and they should, as I say, break the cycle of these repeating bouts of macroeconomic stress that the economy has been suffering for many years now. Now, another thing to say is that people, of course, this government is particularly keen on ensuring that the poverty in Sri Lanka doubled in 2 years. It went up from 13% to 26%. So there are some analysts who claim it's as high as 30%. So we've had this significant increase in poverty. And this new regime should again help in containing poverty, because when you have these macroeconomic imbalances, when you have high inflation, the people who suffer disproportionately are the poor and vulnerable, because they do not own assets which can act as a hedge against inflation. So they get hammered by inflation. Equally, the remedial measures which are taken to address the elevated inflation also disproportionately hit the poor, because you have tax increases. And in Sri Lanka, 80% of the revenues come from indirect taxes, VAT in particular. And as you know, VAT is a very regressive tax. The richest person in the country and the poorest person in the country pay the same rate of VAT. So again, when you have these crises, the effects of the crisis hit the poor disproportionately, and the remedial measures also hit the poor disproportionately. So by avoiding these macroeconomic crises, it is a very pro-poor framework that has been put in place now. So that I should also say another important piece of legislation is the Public Debt Management Act. Historically, what has happened is that the public debt management was highly fragmented. Multilateral debt and bilateral debt was managed by the External Resources Department of the Ministry of Finance. Then syndicated loans and loans from commercial entities, commercial banks, was handled by the Treasury Operations Department. Then the international sovereign bonds were issued by the central bank on behalf of the government. So you had this highly fragmented structure for managing external debt. Now all that is going to be brought into one public debt management office, and that hopefully will enable us to have a more strategic approach to debt management. So these are things that have strengthened the whole kind of framework for macroeconomic policy making, and that's why I think one can talk about a new paradigm for macroeconomic policy making, which should take us away, one, from these repeating bouts of macroeconomic stress, and also with a strengthened institutional architecture for managing debt. Hopefully that will also enable us to avoid the kind of debt unsustainability we have experienced in the recent past. So all that is a positive story in terms of stabilizing the economy and having put in place all these various measures which will strengthen the macroeconomic management. Where we still have a lot of work to do is to create a new growth model. Historically, what has happened is that because we have not been able to do the structural reforms necessary to strengthen the growth framework, we artificially try to create growth, particularly in near elections, by unsustainable macroeconomic policies. Now you can no longer do that. But why? You have to ask the question, why is it that we have not been able to do the structural reforms to create an outward-looking, competitive economy that generates sustained growth and employment creation through export transformation. If you look at all the successful countries around us in Sri Lanka, export transformation is what has driven their growth and growth, and really, they've dragged millions of people out of poverty. China, India, all of them. India, not so much through exports, but certainly China and the other countries of East and Southeast Asia, it's exports that have driven their uh, transformation of their economies. Now, Jaya said that we should we have to export or perish way back in 1978, but we have not been able to do that. In fact, we have gone in the opposite direction. In 2020, the exports of goods and services accounted for about 35% of gross domestic product. Today, it's half that. It's about 70. Equally, in terms of openness of the economy, how you determine openness of the economy is you add imports and exports and look at it as a percent of GDP. It was about 75 to 80% in 2000. It has come down to about 30% today. And as to understand the benefits, to give a vivid example of the benefits of openness, one only has to look at China. The coastal regions of China, which are more integrated to the world economy, have been far more successful and become far more prosperous than the hinterland in China, which is not as integrated, not as open. So that in itself gives you an example of how openness can benefit economic performance. Of course, the world economy is changing now, but despite all the changes that are happening now, I think there's a strong case for integrating with the rest of the world, because if we have a market of 23 million people, purchasing power driven by per capita income about 4,000, and that is not enough to achieve the kind of growth rate we need to achieve. So we have to rely on the external market, and we have to create the conditions for doing that. And one, we've had an anti-export bias in our policy framework. Levels of protection are high, and they channel money into the non-tradable sectors, not to exports. There is the exchange rate has often been overvalued, which then in effect subsidizes foreign producers at the expense of domestic producers. And then we have locked ourselves out of the most dynamic component of the international trading system, which are these global supply chains. Right? Apple is made in 6 countries or whatever. The Apple phone is made in 6 countries or whatever. So you have these production sharing networks. Now in Sri Lanka, we have para-tariffs like the ports and airport levy and these cesses. So what happens is the import comes in, you do your little bit, and then you send it out. But now if you put a para-tariff in the middle, you immediately become uncompetitive because the margins are very fine in these operations. So as soon as you put the ports and airports levy, and as soon as you put a cess, those things completely knock us out. And Sri Lanka has only about 5% of its exports are intermediate exports, i.e. kind of parts of supply chains. In Thailand, Malaysia, etc., it's well above 50%. And as I said, these kind of supply chains have been the most dynamic component of the international trading system, and we have locked ourselves out of it. But the government has now taken a decision to phase out the PAL and the cess, but it will take some time because of the impact on revenue. But at least we're moving in the right direction. So we have to really, and also it's looking at the tariff structure to improve, make it more export friendly. So this anti-export bias in our policy framework needs to be taken out. And the exchange rate also is now being managed much more flexibly. As I said earlier, there was this attempt to defend the indefensible by using reserves, and in the end, the rupee is depreciated at the end of the process, and we also lose our reserves. So now, as part of this flexible inflation targeting framework that we have, the exchange rate has to be the first line of defense against external pressure, and it has to be managed flexibly. So, the macro stuff is in place, and that exchange rate management should help exports as well. Then more flexible management of the exchange rate. Now, the other thing to ask is, why is it that we have not, so the anti-export bias hopefully will get addressed over time. The other thing to ask is, why is it that we haven't been able to undertake the structural reforms to strengthen the growth framework in the economy? Now, in the 1980s, I was seconded from the central bank to the Ministry of Finance, and I worked as the late Ronnie DeMel, the finance minister at that time. I worked as his bag carrier. So I used to go around with him and listen to his speeches. And the structural reforms that he called for in the 1980s are exactly the same structural reforms we are talking about today. Things like the strengthening the factor markets, that is land, labor, and capital markets, strengthening SOE performance, state-owned enterprise performance, improving the investment climate, strengthening investment promotion, having trade liberalization and negotiating trade agreements, improving trade facilitation, strengthening, improving education, training, and skills development. These things we've been talking about from Mr. DeMel's time for 45 years and have made remarkably little progress. So then you have to ask, why is it that these things haven't been done? And there are two possible reasons one can cite. One is that the gestation period on these structural reforms tends to be rather long, because it takes more than an electoral cycle for you to get the payback on these reforms. So there isn't an incentive for politicians to get these done, because their maximum time frame it's one electoral cycle. So if they're not going to get the benefits in that cycle, they're not incentivized to carry out these reforms. And possibly an even more significant constraint is the fact that while these reforms benefit many, there are also a few very powerful losers, because changing the status quo does hit those people who are benefiting from the kind of distorted economic circumstances that exist at the moment. So those people are extremely powerful, and time and again they resist reform. There could be businesses, there could be trade unions. Both parties have resisted reform. And so we have got, as I said, Mr. DeMel was talking about stuff in the 1980s. We are still talking about the same reforms. Hopefully, this government, which has less baggage in terms of kind of connections, etc., hopefully, they have greater space to get these reforms done. And it's essential that we get these reforms done, and there's real urgency about it, because of two reasons. One is that, I told you, poverty has seriously increased, and we need to address that. And secondly, we need to get that kind of growth to ensure that we don't have another debt restructuring in 2020. I'll expand on each of those now. But before that, let me say that the budget speech for this year, which in my view was a pretty balanced document, it's a mixture of market-oriented approach to trade and investment, plus a strong focus on health, education, and social welfare, which is really the government's bread and butter. So it was actually a very pragmatic budget, and hopefully it opens up the way to do some of the reforms that we need to do. And also, as I said, because the government is not kind of hamstrung by some of the baggage that previous governments have had, we can get some of this done. But we really need to do it very quickly for two reasons. One, as I said, it's necessary to address the sharp increase in poverty. The people of Sri Lanka have been extraordinarily patient. There's been a very harsh adjustment that has taken place in the country. So they would want to see some improvement, particularly the bottom 60-70% of the population would want to see some improvement in their circumstances. And because if they don't see that, I don't know how long more they will be patient. And then the social and political implications of them losing patients are likely to be problematic, highly problematic. Then the second reason is we need at least 5% plus growth to ensure that we achieve debt sustainability when the IMF program ends in 2028. And that is also the point at which we have to start repaying the full amount of our debt obligations. Right now, after the restructuring, of course, we are paying less, but also we are right now only paying the interest. We are repaying all the multilateral debt, but on bilateral debt and commercial debt, we are paying interest. And the capital amount and the amortization has been pushed back to 2028. In 2028, we have to meet all our debt obligations and also have sufficient foreign exchange to meet our import obligations as well. So we need to make that transition to an export-led growth strategy very quickly, because A, the people will run out of patience if there isn't a real, if they don't see movement in terms of addressing poverty, and B, we need to make sure we have enough reserves and we are strong enough in terms of foreign exchange earnings to be able to meet our external obligations in terms of debt servicing and import payments. So for these reasons, we need to do these reforms very quickly and aggressively to be able to achieve the levels of growth that are necessary to make sure that we have the reserves and the capacity to, as I said, pay the debt and meet our import requirements. So this has to be done very, very quickly. And also in terms of the growth strategy the government is adopting, and I think here we can see positive elements, as I said, is that their priorities include, of course, tourism. Tourism is a low-hanging fruit in terms of growth prospects. It's started doing very well again, and it should continue. And there are spread effects in terms of all the various supply chains that feed into the tourism sector, the handicrafts, the services, and all that the tourist sector has built into it. Then the second thing is the shipping and logistics sector. Third is the IT services sector. These are kind of the three sectors which clearly have promise in terms of rapid growth. They are growing quickly already, and we need to give them a further boost in terms of building up enough sources of vibrance in the economy to hit the kind of 3% plus growth that we are trying to achieve. The other thing, again, these are priorities for the government. We have to have inclusive growth. We need to have agricultural and fisheries modernization and rural development. The government has allocated quite a lot of money for these purposes, and this we need to get done. Again, these are things we've talked about. We know what to do, but we have not done it. So that has to be done. The second kind of major component of a strategy for inclusive growth is development of the micro and SME sector. So that again, the government is prioritizing it. It's talking about improving the capacity for development banking in the economy, and also trying to create a more conducive environment for building up supply chains for these micro and SME enterprises. Another area which is getting prioritization, which should help both with growth as well as improving service delivery and addressing poverty, is digitalization. So the public infrastructure development is being given high priority by the government, and they've appointed Dr. Hans Vijayasuriya, who was the founding CEO of Dialogue, to lead the work in this area. I know him well. He's a very good guy. He's a very knowledgeable guy, and hopefully we can get things done quickly to shift the agenda on digitalization, which, as I said, will improve delivery of public services for the people, as well as improve efficiency within the economy across a number of sectors. And the final thing, of course, is the mainstreaming sustainability into the economy. Sri Lanka is considered one of the most vulnerable countries as far as climate change is concerned. We need to make sure that we give sufficient attention to sustainability considerations in right through the economic policy framework. That again, the government is sensitive to. I'm not aware of what it is doing, but hopefully that also will be built into the system. I mean, there is a focus on renewable energy generation as part of this strategy. Uh, so, I mean, there are bits and pieces. The one concern I have is whether there is sufficient urgency. As I said, we need to get this 5% plus growth quickly so that people don't lose patience. They see them, their lives improving relatively quickly. And two, we need to be sure that we are in a position to undertake the full repayment of our debt and import and finance the imports that are needed for a growing economy by 2028. So these two things mean that we need to get really have a laser-like focus on the growth agenda. The government certainly is giving it priority. I would like to see a little bit more urgency. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Tarek.
Oh, sorry, Rohan, my sticky mute button. Thank you, Indrajit. That was really insightful, and a number of facts and figures in your presentation that were really interesting and provide some useful context for the economical kind of reality of Sri Lanka. And I'm sure it's generated a number of thoughts and reflections from our listeners. I will hand to Rohan now for a short Q&A. Rohan.
Thank you, Tarek, and thanks, Indrajit, again for that detailed commentary on the paradigm shift towards a new macroeconomic policy framework. Now, you referred to the fact that in 1978, we were talking of a new economic policy, opening up the economy. And here we are today, still talking about it. Not much, well, some things have happened, but we are in economic doldrums. Is it really the policies or actually the policy implementation that we are lacking? And if so, what's the remedy to make sure that we continue to monitor what we are doing, the paradigm shift, to monitor it and make sure we progress? What are your thoughts?
So probably a bit of both wrong policies as well as weak implementation. You know, if you look at the successful countries, particularly in Asia, which have been doing very well in the last 20, 30 years, one thing that is a common characteristic is a national consensus on the overall development strategy. And as I said, export-driven growth is the kind of strategy they have adopted. Now, we don't have a consensus, right? Or at least we have not had a consensus up to now. So then people say, well, you know, it's easy to get a consensus because these are either one-party states or the dictatorships, whatever, then you can do this. But we are a vibrant democracy and we like a democracy and what goes with it. And there it's difficult. If you have a contested polity, it's difficult to have a national consensus. But what kind of challenges that thesis is what has happened in India. India had a massive, I mean, their polity is as contested and as vibrant in terms of democracy as ours is. But in 1991, they had a massive crisis. They went to the IMF. Then they have never been to the IMF since. Because at that time, the Congress Party and the BJP basically came to a consensus in terms of economic policy. There is a story, which I don't know whether it's apocryphal or not, but at that time, Narasimha Rao was Prime Minister and Dr. Manmohan Singh was the Finance Minister. Dr. Manmohan Singh had gone to Narasimha Rao with the IMF program and had said, Prime Minister, this is very, very tough. It's going to be very difficult to get this through. Do you want to consult before we go back to the IMF? And Narasimha Rao had said, just give me 20, 30 minutes, I'll come back to you. And Manmohan Singh was astounded how this would happen. So what Narasimha Rao had done was rung Vajpayee, who was the leader of the opposition, head of the BJP at the time. They had a conversation, and Narasimha Rao had gone back to Manmohan Singh and said, okay, you can go ahead. So Manmohan Singh was astounded. He said, how is it that you managed to do this? He said, there's only one person I need to speak to, and that's the leader of the opposition. He told me, we will shout and scream, but go ahead. Because if this is good for India, we will not bring it down. We let it go through. So that's how the consensus was formed in India, and it has prevailed right through. In our case, we do policy reversals. Each time a government changes, you have massive. I'll give you an example. We had an IMF extended fund facility between 2015 and 2019. And a lot of the things that we're doing now, flexible inflation targeting, flexible exchange rate management, Mangala Sanruira achieved primary surplus in 2017 and 2018. Those were only 2 of 4 years when Sri Lanka achieved a primary surplus since the end of the Korean War period. So it was going in the right direction. But then after the elections that brought in President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, there was a complete reversal of policy. Everything that was being done was thrown out. We even had a medium-term debt management strategy and a rather well-crafted attempt to try to bring ourselves out of the kind of the path we were going towards in terms of a train crash on the debt front. It was clear by 2016, 2017 that we're going to have a massive train crash. And a framework was being put in to handle that. All that was thrown out, and we had these so-called homegrown policies, and we may have had to restructure our debt anyway, but it would have been a far less harsh and far less painful restructuring, because the restructuring may have become necessary because of COVID, but it wouldn't have been what it transpired if we had avoided this massive great reversal in policy. But what is encouraging now is under 3 presidencies, there has been consistency in policy. So President Gotabaya took the decision to go to the IMF. He made 2 fantastic appointments in the governor, Nandalal Veerasinghe, and Mahinda Sirivardhana as the Secretary of the Treasury. Mahinda may be finishing now, but those were 2 crucial. And that also helped to have continuity in policies. Because after that, we went to the IMF under Gotabaya Rajapaksa. Then the program was negotiated under Ranil Wickremesinghe, and President Andhra Kumara has not deviated much from it. He stayed with the IMF program, and the same with the debt restructuring, initiated under Gotabaya Rajapaksa, continued a long way towards completion by Ranil Wickremesinghe. And though the NPP said that they were going to renegotiate the debt, they did not. Right? They didn't undermine the process. They went through with it and have stayed with it. So 3 presidencies, continuity of policies. I hope we can continue like that, because this lack of consistency has been a major problem. So definitely wrong policies at times, and also even when we have tried to go down the right route, we have not implemented very well. Often the implementation has been a very weak aspect of our economic management.
Thank you. Kirti, I can see your hand raised on the screen. But if I can just ask one more question before I give the floor to Kirti. In relation to the production-based or the manufacturing or the output-based economy that both the previous government and this government in particular has spoken about, have you seen any plan implementation, any projects that have been put in place towards a manufacturing-based or output export-based economy so far? Indrajit?
I would say not as yet. It's probably still early days. Let me say one thing. I said we need to get 5% plus growth. And we've been getting about 5% growth in recent quarters. That is due to transitory factors. So we shouldn't, delude ourselves that we are doing well, already getting 5% growth, because it's partly due to the due to the what we call base effects, right? Because the economy contracted by 10% over 6 quarters, ending in the in the middle of 2023, right? For 6 quarters, there was a 10% decline, peak to trough. Then the economy started growing, and so in the last 6 quarters, you had the base effects of moving from contraction to expansion. So that gave a higher growth figure. And once 4 quarters pass, that falls out, right? Because it's really measured year on year. So once that falls out, you lose that boost you get to grow. The second transitory boost is there's been a lot of capacity underutilization in the economy. So what is happening now is, okay, the debt restructuring is done, the IMF program review program is on track, and the Nielsen's survey shows that business confidence has gone up. So what you're getting is that people using that unutilized capacity now. But that unutilized capacity will be available until the GDP reaches the level it was before the crisis. Right? Because there was a certain capacity in the economy which gave you a level of GDP. So until we go back to that level of GDP, there will be capacity to use. But once we go back to that, once we make up the 10% loss in GDP, you have to have new investment. And we will probably make up that 10% towards the end of this year, early next year. So by early next year, we have to create the conditions to get new investment to drive growth. I think that will be really the crunch time. That's when we have to see, exports, that investment coming into exports, etc. Mind you, export performance this quarter was very good. I think that is partly because the U.S. economy has been doing quite well, and the U.S. is our biggest export market. But I think it's too early to say that there is one is seeing a turnaround in terms of investment coming in. Foreign investment is very, very little. I mean, there's that big project the Chinese are doing. They're doing a refinery. Sinopec is doing a refinery in Hambantota. But that's more a government-to-government thing. But in terms of organic FDI, not much anymore. Not much yet.
All right, Indrajit. So we have a question or number of hands raised. So if we go in the following order, Kirti, Gihanta, Anusha, and Leslie. Kirti, over to you first.
Okay, thank you very much, Rohan. And first of all, let me thank Indrajit for a fascinating talk. It raises some interesting topics for discussion. Now, and also, I think Rohan already touched upon some of the things I was going to talk about. Implementation, because I think in Sri Lanka, sometimes we are good at getting ideas, but implementation is not that good. That's one aspect. The other aspect is that when it comes to implementation, the way I understand is that it's very difficult to implement because the politicians depend on the political vote. So in order to get the political vote, they have to keep the voters happy. So unless we educate the voters wouldn't change their views. So would you agree, Indrajit, perhaps we should put some effort to educate the voters to a certain extent so that we can use the right policies and implement them in the correct way. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is when it comes to manufacturing. I think perhaps Rohan already touched on this one. To develop manufacturing sector in Sri Lanka, it's quite a broad, wide issue. In order to develop manufacturing, we need to have the correct type of skill set, correct infrastructure, and so on and so forth. They are both very important for Sri Lanka, in my view. So the first thing is, how can we go about educating the voters? And secondly, what can we do to improve the infrastructure to improve manufacturing? Thank you.
Should I respond, Ron?
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So let me start, before I address your two questions, let me start with implementation. You're right, the politicization of our system does constrain effective implementation. I always say Sri Lankan politicians may not, for instance, the Indian politicians, in my view, are more venal than our politicians. The number of guys with murder charges and all in parliament is more than ours. But what is different in our case is every possible aspect of our lives has been dominated by politics. We have politicized every aspect of our life. Whereas in India, the Indian court system, the public service in particular, etc., have been more independent. We are seeing that come back a bit in Sri Lanka now, to be fair. But for many years, everything was totally dominated by politics and politicians. And that's what really made things were done on the whims and fancies of politicians. So hopefully we have moved away from that. And to be fair by this government, they have said and again that they will opt for evidence-based policy making. It's too early to say whether they will or not, but that's what they've said they will do. So the second thing to say is that we are no longer able to attract and retain good people in the public service because our pay systems, our payment structures are such that there is a serious deterioration in the quality of the public service. I remember the quality of the public service when I first joined the central bank in 1970. Central bank is actually relatively okay. They pay well and they train their people, etc. But the public service, the SLAs in particular, has deteriorated significantly in terms of quality. So that also constrains implementation. Okay, on water education, I 100% agree with you. One of the reasons why we've been able to get really tough things done, like for instance, the removal of the fuel and electricity subsidies, the tax reforms, etc., because, crises are opportunities. The crisis was so severe that people were willing to put up with things because it was considered necessary to address the crisis. So this crisis is an opportunity, and we have done a number of things which we've never been able to do in the past. Hopefully we have a little bit more time. The people will be a little bit more patient to get a few more things done. But I agree with you that water education is a crucial thing. And now I think, I remember one of the big problems I had when I was in the central bank was because I couldn't speak Sinhala. So one good thing is the President of Nandalal is able to communicate brilliantly in Sinhala and he's able to get the messages across. So can the Secretary of Treasury. So I think they are trying to get the messages out from a technical point of view as to what needs to be done. And hopefully there is a process of education taking place. I don't know, it's still too early to tell, but that is something that we need to do. I entirely agree with you. Manufacturing, I think if you look at how the other countries have done it who have been successful, this is where FDI becomes important. Because not only does foreign direct investment bring you capital, it brings you markets, it brings you know-how, etc. Now, if you look at the only kind of big success story we've had as far as manufacturing is concerned, it had these different elements. One, it had guaranteed markets under the multi-fiber agreement whereby quotas were split and given into different countries. So Sri Lanka had a quota and a guaranteed market, right? So it wasn't an organic growth in the sector. We were given a quota. So that helped us with the marketing. The multi-fiber agreement no longer exists, but when the sector grew, it was there, and that helped with the markets. Then we had this guy, Martin Trust, who was extremely influential in the apparel sector. He brought in the know-how and the capital. He was the one who was behind the creation of Brandix and MAS. I don't know whether he was involved with Hydramani, but those are the three big companies. But certainly MAS and Brandix, which are the two biggest, were built, or at least were brought into being by Martin Trust. So we had know-how, capital, markets. Those were all looked after. So this is what we need to replicate, essentially. There is no multi-fiber agreement and quotas, but we have to find markets, and FDI helps you to do that. Martin Trust bought the FTI, the know-how, and the multi-fiber agreement gets to the market. Similarly, we need to. This is where all the other countries which have been successful in Asia, FDI has been a big part of the export transformation story. Our FDI performance has been abysmal, absolutely abysmal. The highest flow we've had was 1.8 billion in 2018, but 1 billion of it was a long lease for the Hambantota port. That wasn't organic FDI either. So we've never got more than 1 billion really. So we are getting something like 1.5% of the GDP. Vietnam is getting 5% of GDP. So, despite all these tax holidays, everything we give, the investment climate just has not been conducive enough. Because you need consistency of policies, macro stability, legal framework, all those things have to be there as well. Electricity costs, all those have made our investment climate not very conducive to foreign direct investment. So we need to sort these things out. The World Bank had a doing business index. It's no longer being published because there was some political problem with it. But it has 10 pillars. We know what those pillars are. We need to improve our performance on each of those pillars. And
Okay.
And the other thing is for manufacturing is, if you look at what happened in East and Southeast Asia, when first Japan and then China had their growth surges, the countries in the region, in the sub-region, plugged into their supply chains. So they call it this wild geese formation or whatever it is. So Japan went up, people plugged into the supply chains. China went up, people plugged in the supply chain. India is now having its growth surge, somewhere between 6 and 8% of growth in the medium term. The 5 southern states in India are growing at double digits. For the whole of India to grow at 6 to 8%. Those 5 states which are more successful are probably growing at close to 10%. I mean, just intuitively, we have a 4 trillion economy sitting at our doorstep. I mean, there have to be opportunities, right? So A, we have to look at India as an opportunity rather than as a threat. And B, and also the Indians need to behave better. They can't try to ask us to pay 8 cents, 8.24 cents per unit for wind power. But so then they talk about neighborhood first. They need to walk the talk on that, and we need to look at India as an opportunity, a 4 trillion economy into which we can plug into. And the government to government stuff has a lot of baggage.
Can I come in very quickly?
Yeah,
Thank
sure.
you very much. Thank you very much for that answer. I really appreciate that. I really hope that in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, we will go in the right direction. And I also agree that India is an opportunity. We must take that opportunity and grow with them. That's my view. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with you very much there.
All right, Kirti. Thank you. Gihanta, over to you. You're on mute. Yep, go ahead.
Thank you, Rohan. Thank you, Indrajit, for your very interesting and clear presentation. I have a few questions. The first one, you mentioned that the government is now put in place sort of improved fiscal and monetary discipline. So I'm curious to understand whether in 2024, did we actually achieve a budget surplus? Did we actually start paying down our debt as a result? So that's the first question, given the discipline. You also mentioned that over the times of the troubles, the economic troubles, that our export sector from being 30% of GDP shrunk down to something like 17%. Such a huge decline. What were the reasons for it? Did our industry actually, industrial base shrink? What's the reason why these exports shrank so much? And then finally, you talked about a few different economic sectors that would be key for our future development. And you mentioned renewable energy is also one of them. But given that the Sri Lankan market is so small, do you think there's an opportunity for us to export renewable energy? Those are my questions. Thank you.
Okay. So performance in 24, we significantly overperformed. The primary surplus in the budget was actually a little over 3%. You know, the target was 2.3. It was a little over 3%. Now, before we kind of pat ourselves on the back too much, part of the reason that happened was because there was significant under expenditure. You know, there were 2 elections. Whenever there are elections, the system really slows down. So public expenditure was much less than anticipated or budgeted for because of the elections mainly. So that helped. And the revenue was actually, we hit the target on the revenue. So that meant that our primary surplus was over 3%. So that, you know, we have got 3% of GDP, which can be used to pay down the debt, right? So because we collected 3% more than we needed as far as expenditure was concerned. So that worked well. And that's why the IMF review also went through okay, because you know, our performance was very much above what was required in the program. Then in terms of the export as a percent of GDP, how did it happen? Now, there wasn't an actual shrinkage in export performance or export output. What happened is that it's as a percent of GDP, right? So GDP grew, but what grew were the non-tradable sectors. Growth was driven by construction, by transport, by growth in the public service from 600,000 to 1.5 million. That's also counted as growth. So those non-tradable sectors grew. And so GDP grew at a much faster rate than the export sector did. So the share of the export sector in GDP came down very sharply. So that was why that happened. Really what we need to do is to see the tradable sector grow much faster than the non-tradable sector. And renewable energy exports, now there is a plan, there are proposed projects. One, of course, is the Adani one, which seems to have now come to a problematic end. But the Indians have also offered to build grid connectivity into the Indian system. In which case, certainly, and the whole idea of the Adani project was actually to do that. The excess capacity which would come about through those large projects would then be exported to India through the grid connectivity that the Indians were willing to build for us. I mean, I think it will probably be some kind of supplier's credit that they'll give us. I don't think it will be a grant, but they were willing to help us to finance it and then to take the surplus that's there to actually could export the surplus. So there is a plan which, if implemented, will enable us to export renewable energy to India.
Great. Thank you very much, Indrajit.
Yeah. I think there's a big demand. If Indian economy is going to grow at 6 to 8%, there's obviously going to be big demand for energy there.
Fantastic. Thank you.
All right. Thanks. Anusha, you're next. You're also on mute. Yeah. Go ahead.
Hi, Indrajit. I'll echo what the first 2 people said about that. That was definitely one of the most comprehensive presentations on the Sri Lankan economy I've heard. But then that's also not surprising given who you are and your knowledge. I also have 3 questions, but I'll make them really quick. But they're really on the smaller aspects of what you've talked about. So the first one is, you started off talking about, how we had a culture of the entitlement mentality, amongst the politicians and amongst the people. Now, from what I know from what happened, with the Aragalaya and everything, a few years ago, that seemed to be prevalent amongst the middle classes, not so much about, anywhere else or in any other class of people. So, and then you also mentioned later on about, there are powerful people or people who are benefiting with bad financial policy, bad financial policy frameworks, and how powerful they were. So my first question with all of that is, how do you do you see this entitlement mentality continuing, and how much of a problem will that be if the government gets resistance from these so-called powerful people? That was my first question. And number two, you've talked a lot about exports, but what's the kind of weighted bias between, if I may put it like that, between imports and exports? Because just from my few trips to Sri Lanka, and I've just come back actually from 6 weeks at end of January, I was there for the festive season. We are agriculturally, we're a very self-sufficient country, and yet what I hear time and time again is that we import far more than we need to, because we have good soil right across the island. So why is it that we're in a situation where we're importing so much, and how much of that kind of counts towards or counted towards the deficit that we've had? So you're talking a lot about exports and how that's going to bring in income, yes, but then how do the cutting down of the imports balance that out? And then the last point was, the tax element, because having just, like I said, come back, I was absolutely horrified. And I know I live in the UK, and yes, things are relatively cheap, obviously, if I'm going out and paying for things. But when I look at a bill, I'm absolutely horrified at the high percentage of tax that I'm having to pay for any meal out. I mean, I was at the in the lobby bar of the Cinnamon Grand, for example. I mean, a couple of times, just ordered some nibbles and some alcohol, and if I calculated it roughly, I think about 40% of the bill came to tax, literally just pure tax. So there was a small percentage that was a service charge, and then the rest of it was tax. So how do you see that reducing, and when do you see that reducing? So those were my three questions.
Okay. On the entitlement culture and whether that can be contained, not easy. And I think I think Keith's comments about voter education, I think also plays into this, to the answer I'm going to give you. I mean, we've had, at independence, we, that was a time, the British were introducing the welfare state, it was at least government that was in power. And so there was kind of left of center policies. And our political DNA is basically left of center. And at the time, the LSSP was the main opposition party. So right from the beginning, and we were a wealthy country at that time. We had large reserves, particularly during the Korean War. We built up reserves, and we were able to give a lot by way of welfare payments, and they were untargeted. Even the richest people in Sri Lanka had a rice ration card and things like that. So it was, and of course, and that was for a population of about, what was it, 6-7 million at independence. So now it's 23, and it became totally unsustainable. That was one of the reasons why Jayawardena had to liberalize the economy and change things around. And since that time, we've been trying to contain the welfare payments. But as I said, we've never had policy consistency. One side was trying to contain the welfare payments and push things into productive activity. The other side would, again, increase the welfare side of things. So I don't know whether we've cracked it, quite frankly. But as I said earlier, because of the depth of the crisis and people felt that they had to contribute to helping to solve the crisis, we have been able to do some tough things which have pushed back that entitlement culture, right? We don't have any subsidy for fuel. We don't have any subsidy for electricity anymore. So one could argue that we have made some progress. And I hope, as long as we can hold the line politically and keep those new arrangements for pricing utilities in place, and also for containing, And we've now started using the right instrument to help the poor and vulnerable. The Ask the Expert program is a cash transfer program, and the way to help the poor is through a cash transfer program, not to subsidize, use subsidies which actually benefit the non-poor more. There's a lot of research done in Sri Lanka that the fuel and electricity subsidies benefit the non-poor much more than they benefit the poor. So those kind of distortions have been taken away. And hopefully that will also help us to move away from the entitlement culture, because we're using the right instrument now to help people. And we are no longer giving these handouts for the to the non-poor. So hopefully it's changing. I think it's too early to say it has changed, but things have been done which would not have been possible in the past because of the severity of the crisis. Okay. Then food and imports and self-sufficiency. So as far as paddy is concerned, one of the problems we have is that the size distribution of holdings, particularly in the wet zone, the holdings are far too small to be viable. They've got fragmented, partly, each generation, the population pressure on the land, particularly in the wet zone, which is where most of the people live, in the southwest quadrant, the land holdings are just too small to be viable. The only way they are kept going is by government subsidies. Government gives them free water, government gives them a guaranteed price, gives them a highly subsidized fertilizer, and basically the government gets their noses above the water, but then they're stuck there. There are a lot of people just above the poverty line in Sri Lanka, because we essentially, for significant part of the paddy sector, we have unviable holdings. So we need, and we have the Paddy Lands Act, which means those lands which are earmarked for paddy cannot be used for any other purpose. So those kind of anachronistic laws will be taken away, and people need to be able to move into, in my view, other cash crops, which gives them a higher return on those lands. And we can grow all the paddy we need in the irrigated dry zone with good agricultural practices. Now, places like the company CIC and even Hari Jawan and his farming interests, their yield is way above the national average. So it shows what you can do with good agricultural practices. So agricultural modernization has to be a key part of the strategy for the country. And in that process, we will be able to reduce our imports by producing more agricultural output. But we have to have a more strategic approach to how we're going to do it. And on the wet zone, as I said, probably move out of paddy. And maybe also we need to, because of the smallness of the holdings, to create farmer associations or cooperatives or whatever. So those kind of institutional reforms also are needed. So yeah, the yields are very low. We can increase it. Agricultural modernization has to be part of the development strategy for the country, and that should help reduce the import bill for food. Third is tax. Now, I think a lot of that will be VAT, or the tax that we paid, because we have a VAT rate of about 18%. I don't know what else is there. I'm a little concerned that you said 40%, because other than VAT, I don't know what else would be on there, and the service charge. But we have a big problem in terms of revenue. It is our expenditure is 19-20% of GDP. Revenue at its trough after those tax cuts that we effected in 2019, 2020, came down to 8%, 8.2%. So we had expenditure at 20, revenue at about 8. It has now gone back up to about 13.5% of GDP. But we are still short of revenue. And so I can't see taxes being reduced anytime soon. I think more, if I'm honest, I feel the wealthy in Sri Lanka are grossly undertaxed. The poor are paying far too much tax. They are paying an 18% VAT. But We have no capital gains tax. We have no wealth tax. We have no debt duties. None of that. So, in my view, the rich really are undertaxed in Sri Lanka. And I think they need to pay more tax over time. But of course, what people say is that they then balk, that if the tax system changes, that they will leave the country. Possibly, possibly. But it's also becoming more difficult to go anywhere, because of the tightening of immigration policies around the world. So that, I think, is a bit of a false claim that people will all rush off. But I think we need to target the burden of tax. At least the people who have broad shoulders and who can pay need to pay more in Sri Lanka. Let me say that. But I can't see anytime soon where we can reduce the tax collection. We'll only have to increase it. But we need to make sure that the increase in taxes are equitably distributed.
Yeah, thank you.
You
Yeah,
pay 50. Now, if you're in the higher income tax bracket, you pay 50% as tax, right, with the national insurance. We have no national insurance in Sri Lanka. So it's only 36%. The marginal rate of tax is 36% in Sri Lanka, as against 50. Now, you can argue that the services you get in the UK are far superior. That's a fair comment. So what we need to do is to improve the services that are provided. Now, this particular government has increased the allocations for health and education, etc. So they're trying to use digitalization to improve the delivery of services. If all that happens, then maybe people will be more willing to pay taxes.
yeah. I think, yeah, equitable is definitely the right word, because from what I've heard, there are lots of wealthy people who've paid little to no tax for
Yeah,
decades for
yeah,
obvious reasons. So, yeah,
that's
okay.
that's right.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. And I'm conscious of the time in Sri Lanka, not in the UK, but I got, perhaps I was thinking of Leslie as the last question, but Andrew, you have raised your hand.
What else would you want to do on a Saturday night apart from listen to Indrajit? Come on. Sorry.
Yeah, it's quite late, of course, in Sri Lanka. That's what I'm mindful of. So, Andrew, you will be the last questioner, but Leslie, over to you. You're on mute right now. Leslie.
Yeah, thanks, Rohan. Also, thanks, Indrajit. I think I still remember the talk you gave soon after the Yapana government came into power. And it was also one of the talks under the APSL Ask the Expert series. So now we are here after 10 years. So we are still listening to you. And it's always a pleasure to listen to your talks about the Sri Lankan economy. Actually, my
I hope
question.
I'm less wrong this time.
Sorry?
I said, I hope I'm less wrong this time.
Yeah, I can see the changes in between, and but as a whole, I don't see any change at all actually regarding the way the economy is moving. Anyway, during these last budget discussions, people are talking about a 13% GDP cap in the expenditure. Now, actually, is it a ruling by the IMF? And also, as the government says that it is preventing giving a lot of benefits to the people, like salary increases and all these other things, because of this cap. Now, how long it will be there, and why is it 13%? Is it related to the revenue, or what is the basis of having 13% cap in the expenditure?
So it is actually built into the IMF program, and the IMF kind of in negotiation with the government comes up with what they call a macro fiscal framework, right? And in that, which they hope will enable us to maintain debt sustainability. So in that macro fiscal framework, we have this revenue target of 15%. With revenue of 15%, they feel, and we have, what do you call it, interest payments are 5% of GDP. So 13% expenditure, non-interest expenditure, 5% interest, and so altogether 18% total expenditure, and revenue is 15%, right? And a deficit at about 3% of GDP, which they think can be financed in a sustainable way. So that is the framework. Now, if we can increase revenue from 15 to 17%, then you can increase your primary expenditure to 15% as well. So I feel that with better tax administration, there is the Revenue Administration Management Information System, which enables connecting all the government departments responsible for large transactions, like the land registry, the condominium authority, the registrar of motor vehicles, the companies, uh, 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 registrar of companies. All those people can be directly linked to the Indian Revenue Department. So any large transaction, immediately the Indian Revenue Department will be aware in real time, and then they can check whether this person, has got a tax file, is the expenditure commensurate with the kind of taxes they're paying. So it's an absolute boost. But the Indian Revenue Department has resisted. The Singaporeans gave us this technology over 10 years ago. It still hasn't been fully implemented because it has been resisted. Similarly, customs, the single window, that's the technology which is available. They again block it because they want at least one face-to-face meeting with the parties so that they can shake them down. So, it's terrible, but if we can get these technologies in, the government has said they're going to try. If they can get the single window in customs and the revenue, they call it RAMIS, the Revenue Administration Management System in IRD, I believe we can increase taxes without increasing the tax rates through better administration. And then if we go beyond 15% in the revenue collection, then that gives us more leeway on the primary expenditure as well.
Right. Okay. Thank
All
you.
right.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, Leslie. Andrew, you
I-
had the privilege of asking the last question.
The
on
last question. Okay, I'll be very brief, Indrajit. Thank you for your excellent presentation as usual. The last time you spoke to us, as Leslie mentioned, was about I don't know, maybe 15 years ago.
Yeah, soon after the Apal government.
Yeah. And I remember.
It was at the High Commission.
Yeah, that's right. And if I remember right, you mentioned two particular aspects which were hindering the economic development in Sri Lanka at that time. One was related to the subsidy to agriculture, to farmers, and secondly, the low taxation in the public sector and also the private sector. So my first question is, has there been a major shift in these two aspects, considering the 15-year gap between then and now? And my second question is, you mentioned that our main export from Sri Lanka is to USA. If so, the Trump's tariff, will that have a major impact on us?
Okay. On tax revenue and agriculture, tax revenue, I think, now that we do have a much better tax structure, and revenue is going up. 10 years ago, I think it's about the same actually. It's about 15% then it dipped down to 8, and now it's coming back up to 15 or so. We need to get it even higher than that. So I would say the focus on having a better tax system is probably greater than it was then, and I think so that we should see improvements going forward. The second thing is on the Trump taxes. Hopefully, we are too small to get onto his radar screen, and we can kind of float along, out of sight. But I must tell you, there is a risk because our exports to the US amount to 2.7 billion US dollars. Our imports from the US is only 700 million. So we have a trade deficit of 2 billion. Now, 2 billion in the US economy is, is a kind of point something, I'm sure. But it depends how they look at these things. It is, we have a large trade surplus against with the Americans. So I don't know whether that will bring us to his attention. So I hope we are just too small, for it to matter. I hope so. Anyway, fingers crossed.
And
But we do have a large trade surplus with the Americans.
I hope AKD does not visit the White House and has a meeting with Trump.
Like what happened with Zelensky yesterday.
Zelensky, yes. I think it's best for us to keep out of the way, not get under his radar screen.
Very true.
Yeah.
Right. I was going to close today's proceedings, but I've just got Akil Fairoz asking a question, Indrajit. I'm not sure 100% whether you are the best person to answer, but let me read the question. He says, I have a question on the renewable energy situation, being that the country is in such a tough spot economically. Do you think we have the luxury to invest in renewables? And it goes on. Do you want to have a quick go at it, or?
I mean, now generation it's private investment. The government is not putting money into it.
Right.
It has opened up generation to the private sector.
Oh, that's good. Yeah. All right. So there you are, Akil. You got an answer to that question. So I think, Indrajit, we should close up now. And can I hand you back to Tariq to bring an end to these proceedings? Interesting 2 hours, 1 hour.
Great. Thanks, Rohan. Thank you very much, Indrajit, from all of us, from the committee and for all of us on the call. That's been incredibly interesting, and we're really lucky to have you with us. Huge thank you. And for all the answers that you've given as well. They've been just really comprehensive and insightful, and super interesting. Thank you to Rohan for facilitating the Q&A. That was great. And to everyone on the call, thank you for attending. And finally, just to say, please feel free to plug this series to colleagues and friends. We'll have more of the Ask the Expert sessions in the future. Keep an eye out. We'll send some comms out on some of it. Indrajit, thank you again. Have a good rest of the evening. I know you're in Sri Lanka. Enjoy the rest of the evening. Enjoy the rest of the weekend.
Anyway, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope you can have better weather by the time I get in there.
Fingers crossed.
We are working on it. Thanks.
Okay,
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Indrajit.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.